All right, Jessica, welcome to the podcast. Welcome back to Shifty Culture. I'm really excited to have you on again.
Oh, thank you. This is going to be a great conversation.
Yeah, well, I'm really excited to dive into Flannery O'Connor and your book that she wrote, but she didn't publish, and you're trying to reckon with it, trying to figure out what does she mean, where is she going, what would she have published if she was able to finish this? Why do the heathen rage? My English friends, my English major friends, are all really excited about this book. This is a really exciting time to be alive. We get some more
Oh,
Flannery O'Connor, right?
yeah.
So it seems like a cool project, but man, it seems like a hard project. Can you take us into your mindset as you started to dig into this unpublished work of Flannery O'Connor?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I hope people are not disappointed. We tried to highlight over and over again on the cover that it is a unfinished work. It is a work in progress, and that this book is a look behind the scenes for that. This is not going to be a novel that we just found and it was fully formed and everything's been revised and perfect and you get a complete story. It's just not what you get. And so there was a lot of debate about whether you even publish it. In fact, the reason it sat in the archives for so long is because scholars thought there's just nothing here. There's just a mess of notes and background scenes and a great idea for a novel that doesn't go anywhere. And I read it and thought, this is really good for people to see that Flannery was in progress on these ideas and that she had not stopped where her collections left off, that she was trying for new ways of approaching characters, new ways of trying to get what she thought to be valuable ideas about who God was and about who we are as human beings, and that she was trying for growing and development. And I think too often we think of Flannery as this kind of finished product, and that we see her work sometimes as formulaic, or we think we understand all that we can about her and that there's nothing more to say. People do this with other writers too, right? Like there's nothing more to say about Shakespeare. There's nothing more to say about Melville. And they did that with Flannery. But if you have an unfinished work, you get to say, oh, there's actually more to say. There was more going on here. And those of us who are scholars and writers and artists, we get to pick up where she left off. And we're part of the story too.
Mm. So I want you to bring yourself into the story and be part of the story. What was it like to start to just find these archives and start to say, wow, look, I'm looking at Flannery O'Connor's writing that people haven't really looked at much.
Yeah, at first it was a lot of fun. And I was newly minted PhD. This was my first year out of graduate school, first year as a professor in the academy. And I was like going to the archives is just kind of part of that process. You go and you try to find things that people haven't found before, and you try to investigate questions that you feel like are important to your time and place based on previous literature. And so it was just when I was kind of going through the motions. And as I start reading these passages, they started coming to life for me. And I started seeing like, wow, she was really working with sanctity, and she was reading St. Jerome at this time, and she was reading Augustine at this time, and she was reading Dostoevsky's Holy Fools during this time. And all these things that I thought I knew about Flannery started to take a different form. And as I'm kind of pulling apart each folder, and granted, a majority of the folders were these repeated scenes over and over again, but at the same time, I was seeing each scene anew, just reading the same scene over and over again in light of what she had previously accomplished, and then what I saw that she was reading and what she was wrestling with. It's like each scene kind of unpacked before me. And I started being like, people need to see these characters, especially I remember being in the archives and I was opening one folder and I read a new scene that she had added. And this character kind of gets nauseated by another character's use of the exclamation point. And I just remember laughing out loud, like, yes, Flannery, that makes sense. When somebody would experience nausea with too many exclamation points, I thought, yeah, I've experienced that too. So, um, yeah, just kind of relating to her work and starting to fall in love with things that I hadn't seen before.
Mm. So as you started to dig into them, what are some of the themes that you thought that she was wrestling with through this project?
Well, when you hear the idea for the novel, everybody just wants it to be finished because it's such a great idea for a novel. So she's writing this somewhere between 1960 and 1963. So people have to kind of take themselves back in time. In some sense, it's almost reading it in 2024, you feel like you're reading historical fiction because it takes place, 40 something years ago. And when you read it, you get to see she has her typical white intellectual Southerner. So anybody familiar with Flannery O'Connor usually has that character that's almost Flannery-esque, where the character, like Flannery herself, left the South, went off to get education off in the North, and then returns home and doesn't know how to belong to the group that he's with, doesn't know how to belong, in this particular case, to this segregated, racially segregated world in which people don't have education. They assume a hierarchy of class and race and gender. And he's trying to adjust himself into this, even though he's been educated supposedly out of it. Those are kind of a typical Flannery character. So in this case, his name is Walter. And what he does is he spends his time writing letters to other people, trying to pretend to be like them, but then also he's a little belligerent and condescending and kind of educating them as well in his own very negative way, very prideful, arrogant way. And as he's writing letters, one of the people he corresponds with is named Una Gibbs, and she's in New York. And she is someone who has burst through the ceiling of religion, and she has discovered the spirituality of everything and the connection between all human people. And so she has become an activist on behalf of those who are poor and those who are marginalized racially. And so he starts challenging that. And he says, you think you would love me, but actually I'm Black. And he pretends to be Black to test whether this white woman in the North, can actually love him. And she says, I'm going to come meet you. You're going to realize that we can actually touch, that we can actually be friends or maybe lovers. We don't really know what Flannery's intention would have been there. And that's where the novel just kind of breaks off, as this potential meeting between these two people of these two different worlds at this time.
It has a lot of things to do with identity and race and different cultures clashing together. It sounds fascinating. I would love for her to be able to finish that. What does it look like for you? I'd love to start to now, as we're diving in a little bit to her novel, just get into the process of what was her process like. Is it, as you were reading those things, is it like other writers' process? Was it different? What was she really struggling with in the process of writing?
So people who are familiar with Flannery O'Connor know a few things biographically about her process. We know that she wrote every day from 9 to 12, that she said she wrote those 3 hours and she recovered the rest of the day, right? And that she only did that, but every single day, no matter what, she would write. What it looks like when I looked at the folders is, even if she didn't have a new idea, she would rewrite the episodes from the days before. And so when I used to read her letters where she talked about being in front of the typewriter and just being ready for the process to take hold, I didn't realize what she was doing. It was literally just typing, even if it wasn't a new thing, even if she's just retyping what previously was written. So we have all these manuscript pages where she's redoing the scenes and she changes maybe a dozen words on a page, maybe, or changes a syntax, breaks her sentences more into short form sentences rather than compound and complex sentences. But for the most part, the content ends up being the same. The other thing people usually know about Flannery is that she was a meticulous revisionist. She constantly revised and revised and revised. And I think that's one of the things that's missing from this work, is that especially if you're a grammar maven, if you know grammar well, you'll see in her work that in her published material, she makes choices against grammar purposefully, but everything feels controlled. She always knew what she was doing. Whereas if you read the unfinished material, there's no revision. And so it feels, not no revision, but there's not enough. It's not Flannery's level of revision. So you get a sense that there was so much work more to do, especially for such a perfectionist. And so it feels a little chaotic, less controlled than some of her published work, even on the sentence level.
How do you think that relates to how authors write now? Is it similar? Is it the same, or does everybody just have a different process?
I would assume that everyone has a different process. I love going to the Catholic Imagination Conference, which is like this big biannual event in which all these Catholic writers come together. And, they always talk about this haunting of Flannery O'Connor that kind of happens at these conferences. But they all have their own way of going about writing. There's so many people. Some people can write in spurts. One of the writers I know, he talks about how he rides his bike because he's writing in his head and he needs like his body to be doing something while he's writing. Others have followed Flannery, and this is also Walker Percy, followed Flannery's method, like just sit in the dark room, like by yourself with no inspiration, and just make sure you're there and you're faithful to that page, that blank page, no matter what. So I think people have a lot to learn from what worked for her, but also trying to figure out what works for them in that process. So you can imitate Flannery, but you don't have to copy her exactly to learn from her.
Yeah. So take me into, so what was Flannery O'Connor? What were the big themes that she was addressing in her published work? And what was she evolving into and trying to think about? And what was she processing in this work?
So her first novel is Wise Blood. It comes out in 1952. And when she wrote that, she was 25 years old writing this book. What you'll notice there is that she kind of has like this anti-capitalism thing going. So, the work is very much about the church without Christ, but it's why is the church without Christ? Because of advertisers, because of marketers, because of those who are kind of robbing people of their souls and giving them these false sense of happiness that is sentimentality and pornography and these kind of seductions of that world, of the capitalist consumer world. And so that novel is a different theme than I think later comes out in her work. So that's 1952. I love that work. I definitely understand what she was going for there. I mean, Coca-Cola was newly on the rise. And so you see things like that happening in that fiction. But then when she gets into her short stories, which is really where she excelled, she starts focusing more on the church without Christ for each person. And so she has less of these, what's wrong with who's speaking for America today, and more of okay, what's wrong with the human person? How are we misseeing God? How is each person kind of blind to who they are and the self and the role that the self plays in the conversion experience? And so in those later stories, she is focused on really slamming her characters into the ground, into this moment of like self-awareness, where they can see their own blindness and their own personal responsibility for that, and then how grace intercedes and helps them out of that spot. So she talks a lot about the truth is above us rather than below us, a God that we understood would be less than ourselves, whereas the truth is something we should judge ourselves against and not the other way around. And you'll see that in a lot of her letters and essays, that she's trying to tell you how to read that collection of stories. When you get to Violent Bear It Away, whoa, I mean... At that point, she is really digging into the extreme. What would it look to be on fire for Christ? So not just a moment of conversion to know that this is real and that God is there, and what does that mean for the personal life? But if he is, then how do you live fire for him? Like, how do you go and spread the gospel of mercy to everybody? And that's kind of the conviction that takes place in that work. She's then trying to see, like, how do you live this out? What does that look like? What crazy, holy foolishness would look like? At least that's how I read that. And again, I'm one reader of Flannery. I know there's lots of different readers on Flannery, so I don't want to reduce it and say that these are the only themes or the only ideas. But those are some kind of the major themes that she's getting at. Her last collection of short stories were actually published after her death. And one of the things I'm constantly talking to people about as this book's coming out, they're like, how could you publish something posthumous? You don't have her permission. Most of what we have of Flannery actually is posthumous, including this collection of short stories that everybody considers canonical. Everything Rises Must Converge. She didn't get to see it published. And in fact, her complete stories, there's so many of them that we would not have had her permission to publish, right? That she pulled from publication, or she chose not to publish, and yet we published them anyways. So she's working with a lot of the same themes, and I think we can feel safe that she would have wanted us to publish everything she wrote, because she was just that kind of person. She wanted to get the stuff out there, and she leaves us plenty of material that suggests that.
Mm. So as she was wrestling with that, why Do the Heathen Rage, what were there themes that were evolving, and she was interested in something different?
Yeah, I think so. So we have, I mentioned earlier, she's talking about these personal conversions and these moments of self-awareness. And some people say that she was getting at the more social justice. That's the language that people use. I think that that's, of course, we're using language of today to talk about something in the 1960s. It's a little bit difficult to put the language backwards, but at the same time, those were the issues that were around her. That's what she was getting at. She had a TV for the first time in her house. You know, she saw the Kennedy assassination. She heard Martin Luther Jr.'s speech, King Jr.'s speech. So she was like getting to see these things in real time, and they were affecting the way she saw the Christian life. So the Christian life was not just the personal and not just the living out of the prophecy and the living out of the kind of craziness for God, but also would have social ramifications. And as she became more and more interested in those, I think that's what she was trying for in this last work, is to go from kind of the personal knowledge of who God was all the way to, okay, then how do you love your neighbor? Right? What does that look like then if you actually believe that God is who he says he is?
Mhm. How is she dealing with race? I know her dealing with race has been controversial recently, and what was she doing? She's looking there's a character that's pretending to be black in his letters. She did that with her friends as well sometimes. And so how do we reckon with what she was doing in the race conversation?
Yeah. Well, and you said that she pretended to be black in her letters, which she didn't pretend to be black in her letters, but she did pretend to be people in her letters. She
Yeah,
did.
okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
She had farces where she would pretend to be certain persons. And that's why reading her letters is not so cut and dry as some people try to make it, especially when it comes to race. So she would put on the persona of the bigoted, racist Southerner that she was around, and she would play that role in certain letters, but that's not necessarily evident of what she believed.
Yeah.
We also, I think, we have to differentiate between what Flannery thought or believed and what she wanted to think and believe. I know that sounds a little strange, but I give the example in the book, and it's to me, it's one of the most helpful examples just from my own life. I'm sure people have their own stories, but my husband and I, 20 years ago or whatever, we did not grow up in churches where women preached. And we would have told you, like, the scriptures say absolutely not, that you cannot have women preaching. Well, by the time we got married, we were both on this journey of thinking, like, maybe they can. But my husband was still very uncomfortable with it. He would hear people's arguments and he would go through the reasons of, like, yeah, it would make sense to open that role up for women to preach from the pulpit. But it felt wrong to him. Even though he could say it was right, he could cognitively and register that it was correct for him. And again, your listeners don't need to agree with me, but this is, to me, a good example of what it looks like for Flannery and race. But he couldn't get comfortable with it personally until now. And that's been about 10 years of a journey. So for Flannery in the early 1960s, she was registering that she was pro integration, right? She loved the work that Father McCowan and Dorothy Day and Koinonia Fellowship that they were doing. I shouldn't say love. She would hate. She doesn't talk like that, but she would approve. And she even says in her letter she admired things like that. She was reading biographies about people like Richard Allen, the famous African American preacher, and she was trying to get more accustomed to the things that most of her culture was antagonistic to when it came to race, like integration. So she was more pro civil rights. And at the same time, her comfort level wasn't there. After being raised almost 40 years in a segregated world, she did not have the experiences that made her comfortable. And therefore, a lot of that you get to see in her letters. But when it comes to her art and her stances, she was trying to move us, her readers, especially those that she was around, and herself even, towards a place in which we could all see ourselves in one another, that we could identify this kind of common humanity that we had. And especially when it came to sainthood, and you see this in the story of Revelation, that we were all going to be worshiping God together, that we were all part of the Revelation vision of many tribes standing before the throne of the Lamb. So that is where her imagination was headed, even though people are more critical about how she practiced that during her lifetime.
Mm. So when we intellectually assent to something, we go, I know that's right. I know that's good, but I don't feel it in my body. How do we get from knowing something to living something?
Yeah. So, if we look back in the history of ideas, we see this in
All the way
the
back to the history of ideas.
well, I'm sorry, I'm a great books professor, so like I can't help but see it in a tradition. But when you look back at the 18th century, you have this kind of move where we dichotomized it, where it was like, well, we can intellectually assent to that, and that's all we need. So you have the Enlightenment, and then you have, well, you can only emotionally register things that are true, and so you have the Romanticism. But by the time we have later, we have this move in which we recognize the necessity of both. That you can't that the work of the intellect should not be a separate work from the imagination, and in fact they should bolster one another. One of the ways of looking at this, like look at Dante and how the world of the Dominicans and the world of the Franciscans end up dancing around one another in heaven and showing each other how the imagination and intellect work together. And I think we see this in Flannery. What she was trying to do with her art is that she would think through something. She was always reading Thomas Aquinas, so it's a great example of Dominican intellect, your reasonessence to something. And then she was also, as an artist, reading von Balthasar, de Lubac. How does the imagination play out? How do you see these things embodied? Right. And so she was trying to take us as well as herself from a place of, I intellectually assent to all people being equal. And now I need to move there through my imagination so that my practices bear that witness. So I'm a big believer in how that role of the imagination helps us move from things we assent to intellectually to things that we can actually live in our bodies.
Mm. What were some of the scenes that helped us do that in this work that she was working on?
So I think some of them they're at their early stages. They're more intellectual than anything else at the beginning, and that's why I would have loved to see where this would have gone, because intellectually the character, and it's a weird conversion. So most of Flannery's conversions, if you look back at like Wise Blood or Violent Bear Away, to just name the novel examples, you have characters, like I said, she slams them to the ground, right? Their moments of recognition are more like Paul on the road to Damascus. She just knocks them off their horse and says, like, this is, or camel, whatever it was. And she says, this is the light. And who is the God that you are persecuting? In this work, she's not doing that. She is much more converting someone like C.S. Lewis was converted. Here's all the reasons you should believe. Here's all the theology that this guy has read. And he has to just say yes. Right. So it's a more cognitive move that she's making with this character. She said that she wanted to be like God's still small voice talking to Elijah in this work, and less about the slamming to the ground. So we get to see that, and I think this is why it's so crucial to understand her perspective on race, because she was she was rationally consenting to it first. And so Walter's story in some ways parallels Flannery's own story about the things she read made sense, and she was first making that step of cognitive assent.
That's really good. That's great. As with Flannery O'Connor, as she's what is that? She's bringing in some of these, being a Catholic. What does that mean for her and her writing,
Mm.
as she's writing as a Catholic, but for a general audience?
Hmm. She would not have been able to separate them at all. And they didn't have, so if you look kind of, again, I just keep going history of things, right? But evangelical fiction doesn't come around until the 60s. So this wouldn't have even been something where she felt like she was competing with a certain audience. There wasn't a sense of Catholic fiction. She knew the great Catholic writers like Mauriac and Blah and Green and Waugh and so forth, even her fellow artist Percy in the South. So she knew people who were Catholic who were also writers, but none of them were writing for a subset of people. In fact, Catholicism was so marginalized in America during that time, and even I would say segregated. If you look at Savannah and its layout, like where the Catholics resided, right, and where they went to church. So you had people in these subset groups, but when you entered the workforce, you didn't enter a Catholic job. As a Catholic artist, you were just an artist. And so Waugh was writing for the masses, Percy was writing for the masses, and they were bestsellers. So Flannery didn't really have to separate those things. She was more evangelical just by nature of who she was and what she was writing. And what I mean by that is, she even said, like, if I was a Protestant, I would have been a Pentecostal. She very much wanted the spirit to be moving in her work.
Mm.
She would write things like, God, make me your typewriter. And I received a story from God. It's always your story, God, not my story. The book is done. I give it into God's hands. And so there's a lot of ways that her Catholicism even sounds more evangelical, and how she was, letting her art be that kind of gift to the world in the hopes that God would use it for people to be brought to him.
What other things, how does her being, I don't know how I would say it, and she's not really an invalid, but she is stuck in her house. It may be the right word for it, but she is stuck in her house because she is sick, and she isn't. She does go out to lunch every day, but she doesn't really get out quite as much because she doesn't have that much energy.
Mhm.
She has a little bit of energy in the morning to write, then, as you said, she recovers the rest of the day. How is somebody who is stuck at home with low energy, how does that affect her work and her view of God?
So one of the best books I read on this for Flannery specifically was Michael Bruner's The Subversive Gospel of Flannery O'Connor. It's so good. So I'm just going to steal from him, but I'm giving him full credit, and people should go buy his book. But one of the things that I just love that he talked about is theologically this idea of limitation, and how limitation, in some ways it's like and this is Maritain now, I'm kind of jumping to something else and adding it together. But Jacques Maritain talks about art needs a frame in order to be the best kind of art, so you can
Mm,
see what it is. And so you need this kind of frame around the art. And then Bruner takes this idea and say, for Flannery, in some ways, the limits that she had by her energy, and the limits that she had, as someone who was on crutches and who couldn't travel, and who was dying of lupus and never knew, when she was going to die. She lived 14 years under that kind of cloud, that burden of suffering. That gave her a frame that changed what she looked at and how she saw it so deeply. So she was not traveling the world. She was not collecting stories from lived experiences in exotic places. But she was going so deep into that little small square of soil that she was placed on, and able to know characters more fully, able to write Southern voices more authentically, especially, I mean, Southern white voices, what I would say, that she interacted with and knew so well. And because of that, I think her art, it's not just realistic, it's more than realistic. It's able to dig those things, to use her language, from
mm,
underneath the surface,
mm,
and to dig down deep and put the eternal things up where they belong in our focus.
mm. So what is the power of being in place and staying in one place and not being a wanderer, but
Mhm.
being as Samwise Gamgee is in The Lord of the Rings, as a humble gardener, and saying, all I want is my little plot of garden soil here.
Right. Yeah, I think the necessity of particularization rather than moving into a world of abstract or superficiality. So Flannery's a good writer on getting to see what this looks like and how it benefits people to focus on their place. I think Walker Percy is a good one to look at on the other side, who shows us the dangers of going outside of your place, right? So he has a character, being Spolling, who travels to Chicago, and he's like, you go to Chicago and you're a nobody nowhere. Whereas when I'm home in New Orleans, I'm a somebody somewhere. And
Yeah, so I'm excited that uh, yeah, Ethan Hawke made this a biography of Flannery O'Connor. Just heard last week that it will get a theatrical release, and so someone picked it up, and it's going to be out in theaters. And so I just saw that, yeah, just this last week, which is really exciting because we got to know a little bit more of Flannery and her biography. Do you know, where is he taking some of this? Where is he taking the story, this biography? What's he trying to portray in Flannery O'Connor?
so I haven't had a chance to even read the script or see it yet. So I'm really excited about getting to do both. I do know that even in the process that people, I saw the early days before Ethan Hawke came on, Joe Goodman was the first person to kind of talk about doing the story of Flannery. So I got to see some of the earliest scripts from a while ago, and then just kind of seeing it kind of transform. I know that they're trying to do an integration of her art and her life, and not just how her fiction ends up being biographical, but I think what they're trying to say is, in some ways, the interiorness of Flannery is best seen in some of her fiction, right? Kind of the ways that she puts herself into the character relays or lets us know more about what was going on interiorly. Because if not, as Flannery herself said, a biography of me would be so boring because it would just be life between this couch and the chicken yard. Like there was not enough to have a great story. You don't have Joan of Arc. You don't have this massive saint story to get to write about. You have something very simple where most of Flannery's life is lived at a typewriter. So I
Mm-hmm.
think that they're trying to say that what happened on the typewriter was much more alive, and that there
Mm.
was more story, there was more copy there than if we only look at what Flannery's biographical details tell us, which is very limited. But I do think it's also really good timing for a film to come out, because Flannery's birth centennial is next year, March 25th, 2025. So we're
Mm.
about to be on 100 years. We have this unpublished novel that I'm putting out. I'm doing a great courses on Flannery that's going to come out with Amazon, with Audible soon. So I think there's going to be just a bunch of Flannery for people to get invested in and maybe reconsider her in a different way.
Awesome. I want to talk a little bit about that then, with the great courses that you're doing. What are you trying to portray? What are you trying to get out? Why should we say, I'm going to sign up for Jessica's great course on Flannery O'Connor?
Yeah, I think that she deserves a reconsideration. I don't think I realized how much that was needed until the 2020 discussions about race came out, and it was kind of like a headliner, like how racist was Flannery O'Connor, and it was almost this expose or an attempted expose that Flannery was racist, and I just thought, whoa, I think I've been hiding under a rock where Flannery was celebrated and amazing, and I didn't realize that there was this very antagonistic other side that saw Flannery different and that read Flannery, I would say, poorly. So one of the things that I'm trying to do with this Amazon is to consider, or Audible courses, great courses, is why was Flannery so great? Why can we not just dismiss her and say she wasn't challenging, she wasn't a good writer, the hype is not what we find. Like, the hype is not worth it at the end. And so trying to dig into some of her major works and her major themes and say, no, she is not just a writer of her time and place, but by writing about her time and place, she's actually given us something universal that we can
Mm.
pass on, not just for this generation, but for the next generation. And if we lose her, I think we're going to have a major blind spot still in how we view the church
Mm.
and how we view each other. For me personally, the things that she's taught me about how I'm not one person, but I belong to other people, kind of the Nietzschean autonomous self, she deconstructed for me. She took that apart, that there is a danger to, you do you, or believe in yourself. Flannery takes that down in her work. And I think that we would go back to some of those blindnesses without her.
Mm. Where's the intersection of grace in her
Mm.
work?
Yeah. And this is, as a Protestant, I was raised, I think, unintentionally and without people even examining the connection between the body and the soul. And so if you would have asked me at 18 or maybe 15, before I read Flannery, the connection between the body and the soul, I would have thought the body is a shell that dies and then my soul gets to go to paradise.
Mm.
And Flannery, because of how she depicts grace, that grace intrudes into our nature and yet also belongs to our nature, that there's something about our nature that by its goodness is still longing for the good. It's still
Mm.
longing for the eternal. And the way that grace has to break in there, but that when it saves us body and soul. And that those things are so intimately connected. That was
Mm.
powerful to me, to experience the idea of experiencing grace in my body, that grace is an infleshed state, right? That
Mm.
my body's being sanctified while my mind and my heart and my soul are being sanctified. And that happens in her work. Things matters in
Yeah.
Flannery. And she taught me so much about that, that I can hardly imagine how I would have been conceiving of theology without Flannery.
Mm. And grace is very given unexpectedly to many of her characters. Like we wouldn't expect that this character would have any grace or be given any grace because they don't
Mhm.
really deserve it. But she gives them grace, often shockingly so. I think there's a shockingness about her characters that then receive this a moment of grace.
Mhm.
I think she writes some beautiful things, some really beautiful things.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
I would say, I don't think we recognize how necessary that is. But I was teaching a class recently and a student was trying to explain how he understood Augustine. And he said, we've got Augustine is realizing that you have to work really hard to be a good person in order to get to heaven. And I thought, okay, I'm going to tell you right now that fourth century father would have no idea what you're talking about, right?
Yeah.
But just our misconceptions about grace, Flannery's correcting them,
Mm,
and she is more Augustinian. She is more along the lines of what you're talking about. That we kind of go through the motions. Augustine would say we're going through the business of life, where these daily things that we think are so important. And what Flannery does is the reason she breaks grace in is to show us the givenness of this reality that
mm,
we're living out this gift. And in order to do that, you have to take these very ungrateful people and make them grateful because they don't see what that they have as a gift. And in order to do that, usually have to have some sort of violence or shock that makes them realize their want or their lack so that they can realize then the gratefulness of grace.
mm. Yeah, that's beautiful. W- What would you want to give the readers of Why Do Heathen Rage? What is your hope for them? What do you want them to get out of this book?
I had someone recently ask me about when to read this. Do we read Flannery first or do we read this book first? I understand that most people need to read Flannery's short stories before they would jump in to Why Did the Heathen Rage? Because in some sense it's a completion. But I'm also kind of hoping it's a new way of starting with her too. That by getting to read this story in which she was in progress and that she was in process, they will go back and read her with a certain generosity and charity that I think is demanded. If I could say there's one problem with current ways of reading, it's the lack of charity that people read with. And I'm hoping that my Why Did the Heathen Rage reteaches us how to be charitable readers for reading Flannery or really reading anything, but that this book could be a caveat for that.
Say a little bit more about that. Why do you think that there is a lack of charity? What is that for you? And what do we need? Why do we need to be charitable as
Sure.
readers?
Well, even the headline that I mentioned, it was 2020. How racist was Flannery O'Connor? So the fact that we can label people, you put labels on jars when something's done. You put labels on things where it's like you know exactly what it is and exactly what to expect, and there's no more to be expected, right? And that's such a caricature way of looking at people that you would just say, this is the villain in the movie, this is the good guy in the movie. And instead, people aren't like that. There should be no way of saying this person is racist, right? As though they're finished. That to me is a lack of charity. But instead, to be able to go back to the reading of a work and kind of walk through even a short story, I think, think something like Greenleaf. In what ways am I like Mrs. May? In what ways am I like Mrs. Greenleaf? I actually personally, when I read Greenleaf, I want to be like Mrs. Greenleaf. And most people, the first time they read that book, they think she's the crazy person, right? And they kind of really reduce her and say, like, she's
Mm,
the crazy person on the side of this manuscript. And you have to say, well, but it's titled after her. So maybe Flannery is trying to get you to reconsider how you see that crazy person. Maybe you're supposed to reconsider yourself. And the charity that you show to Flannery is either going to be reflected back to you and you're going to be able to reread yourself with charity and grace or not because of the kind of ways that you were reading. So I think charity becomes this process by which when we exhibit it, we are receiving it from the work itself. And when we instead read with certain skepticism towards her characters or reductionism, that's all we're going to receive. We're going to receive very little. And I think you see this in her stories too, that the characters who look at the world expecting very little or holding on so tightly to things, they miss out on the grace stories.
yeah, yeah. What character do you love in Flannery O'Connor? Like, what are I? You may not be able to say your favorite character, but what are some characters that you really love that she
Yeah.
has written?
I wasn't just mentioning Mrs. Greenleaf on a side note. That actually is like I could print a passage of Flannery O'Connor and put it on my wall as like a regular prayer, it would be Mrs. Greenleaf. I love Mrs. Greenleaf. The statue of Saint Teresa getting stabbed by the arrow in that moment of ecstasy. It's beautiful, but like Saint Teresa looks gorgeous in that statue, and you see her in this moment of awe, and you just think like that's what the holy life looks like, and it's just beautiful and lovely. And that same moment Flannery captures in Mrs. Greenleaf, but you have this overweight woman in dirty clothes laying on the floor, screaming, Jesus, help me, stab me in the heart. And she is her own 20th century embodiment of St. Teresa, right? It's how do we continue to live out sanctity in each person's own time and place and own body? And it's just that moment to me in Flannery is so gorgeous. Because I think like I want to open my arms like that and every time I read it and say like, stab me in the heart in my time and place, Lord, stab me in the heart. What do I need to see? What do I need to look for? How can I be that open to everything that you could be doing? And so she's by far, that's probably one of my favorite moments in all of Flannery O'Connor.
Mm. So you would recommend Why Do the Heathen Rage? Because I would as well. It's really good, fantastic writing. I love that you actually just had this project of unearthing something and then reflected on a work in progress of what she was trying to come up with. I think it's so good. I think everybody needs to, I would say, start there.
Mm.
And then where would you point people to if they could go? What's next after
Mhm.
that? Where would you want them to start with Flannery after your book, of
Oh,
course?
thank you. Well, I think her short stories are phenomenal. One of the things I recommend in my book on her is that you start with the back of her complete stories because she was a master short story writer more so than a novelist. More people who are readers usually go for novels because short story is not really a popular genre anymore. But her short stories really are where it's at. They're just so good. So I would say pick up a complete set of her short stories, but don't start with story one. Go to the back of the book and start with Revelation, Parker's Back, Judgment Day, Everything Rises Must Converge. I feel like as you get adjusted to Flannery and you see what she's doing, then you'll be ready for stories like Good Country People, A Good Man is Hard to Find, The Life You Saved May Be Your Own, where there's just a lot more violence and it really can kind of shake and alter your world. Whereas those other stories, characters live through them. They're moments of reckoning. They actually get to breathe on the other side of. And so I feel like those stories are more palatable. They also are stories that she wrote at the end of her life where she was just becoming more and more of a master of her own craft. And then as you go backwards, I think you won't be as startled in the wrong way. You'll be able to hold on to the right horror when you read those earlier stories.
Mm, interesting. So, I wanted to get into horror, but we won't get into horror. I want to say, what have you been reading that is starting to change your mind, that helps
Mm.
you have a more embodied experience with God
Oh,
in your life?
fantastic. Yeah, so I'm working on a new book, of course. So what I'm working on right now is on women and trying to explore these 1930s writers on women, and especially within the church, because I think the feminist movement has one kind of story to tell, and the way that the feminist movement plays out post 1940s and the Simone de Beauvoir, it doesn't really fit the church. And as a Christian, I thought feminism was like a dirty word. And so, I didn't see myself in that narrative. But if you go back to the 1930s, if you go back before the existentialist, you get to see these really feminist writers who would have never used that language. And yet they're saying things about what women are and why we matter to the church that I hadn't considered before. And they're not all agreeing with each other. So three that I'm looking at is Dorothy L. Sayers, Edith Stein, and Anna Julia Cooper. And all three of them say something different. I mean, Edith Stein thought, motherhood was the end all be all for all women, even though she herself joined a convent and, became a spouse of Christ. Really, she found her way of being motherhood in more of a metaphorical sense. Dorothy L. Sayers was a mother, but she hid it from everybody. So she didn't talk that way. Work was the end all be all. Like you had to work. Angela Cooper, for women were educators and we were meant to be educators. And there's all these different ways of educating with your heart and your head and your hands. And I just think, so she was more writing in a social construct of passing on to the next generation. And So just kind of wrestling with that, these different ways of what it means to be a woman and how to define that within a church setting that hopefully offers a counter to the feminist world in which we have to become like men to be valuable, or in some of the conservative church world that I've been a part of where women were second and not preeminent. And so trying to capture somewhere in between where we're rebelling against both of those. As Dana Joya says, we're women are twice rebels, right? We can't be reduced on either side of that. Where do we fit in the middle? And that's what
Mm.
I'm trying to discover right now.
Well, hey, I hope you discover it because it's needed. Women need to not be marginalized on either side, and don't need. They need to be pushed back on both sides because, hey, you're beautifully and wonderfully made by your Creator, made in the image of God with dignity and worth and value, and that could bring a lot to this world and society just because of who you are. And so, of course, women need that. Like, that's who women are because God has created you. And so, I'm excited for
Thank
that
you.
to work in that and figure it out because I think the church needs it as well because you can't just say, "Oh, I don't like feminism," or "Hey, I don't like being second in
Mhm.
everything." So it's a necessary thing to wrestle with and grapple with. How could people go out and get Why Did the Heathen Rage? Where would you like to point people to? How can people connect with you?
Sure, absolutely. So I know Baker has it listed. It's for pre-order until tomorrow, which is probably not going to go.
Yes, yeah. Probably not going to
Figure
get
that
it
out.
out by tomorrow, but
It comes out January 23rd, and so then it's available. Some of my favorite bookstores, the Hearts and Minds bookstore is really good. Eighth Day bookstores, those are two of my favorite kind of local bookstores that also have things available online. So that's where I would point people to. If you also want a signed copy, you can go to my events page and see where I'm going to be and get it signed by me to you personally. Or you can contact me via Twitter or email and send me your address and buy a copy from me, and I'll send you a signed copy.
awesome. That's great. Well, Jessica, thank you for this conversation. It was fascinating to dive into Flannery O'Connor and her writing and her work in progress. And I'm just really excited about people getting their hands on this book because it is fantastic. As you do a wonderful job. And so the work that you did with this and the years of work that you put into it is well worth it. And I think it came out beautifully. So thank you for your work and what you
Thank
did
you.
and bringing this to life for us. So thank you, Jessica.
Yes, thank you, Joshua. I really enjoyed this. Thank you.
Thanks.